Pull your chair a little closer tonight. What I want to talk about isn't easy, but it matters, and I think if you're watching this one, some part of you already knows why you clicked on it. Somebody told you, once, that grief gets smaller with time. Maybe a well-meaning neighbor said it at the funeral, or a sister-in-law said it a year later, in that gentle voice people use when they want you to be finished with something. Give it time, they said. It gets easier. And you nodded. Because what else do you do? And some part of you has been waiting ever since for the day the missing him finally shrinks down to a size you can carry without noticing it. I need to tell you something tonight, gently but honestly. That day isn't coming. And that isn't the sad part of this story. That's the beginning of the good part. Get your tea or your coffee, whatever's keeping your hands warm. Let the fire do what it does. Because what I actually believe, after all these years, is that grief doesn't get smaller at all. It stays close to the exact size it always was. What changes, slowly and almost without your noticing, is you. You get bigger around it, stronger around it, until one day the loss that once filled your entire chest is simply one room in a much larger house you've built since. A house with 100 other rooms in it now, rooms for laughter you didn't expect to have again, rooms for people you've let back in, rooms for the version of yourself you're only now getting to meet. You've read that last text from him 3 times. I know, no, not him. I misspoke. Forgive me. Some nights the tenses still slip on me too. What I mean is, you've caught yourself reaching for the phone to tell him something, some small thing, a funny thing that happened at the grocery store, before you remembered, mid-reach, that there's no one on the other end of that particular number anymore. None of this is your fault. It isn't a failure of moving on. It's simply what a life built around another person does. When that person is gone, it keeps reaching toward the shape of him, out of pure habit, the way water keeps running downhill along a channel long after the rain has stopped. The house that used to be loud at dinner time is quiet now by 5, and there are evenings when that quiet presses in on you with a weight that surprises you, even this many years in. You've watched everyone else's family photos online, the anniversaries, the couples still finishing each other's sentences at 70, and wondered, quietly, unfairly, what you did to deserve losing yours so early. You haven't done anything. I want to say that plainly, because I don't think anyone has said it to you plainly enough. Grief doesn't visit the guilty. It visits the ones who loved enough to have something worth missing. Here's the part I actually want to sit with tonight, though, because I think it's the part almost nobody says out loud. There is a specific kind of guilt that comes later, not the guilt of the early grief, the disbelief and the anger, and the terrible practical logistics of it all, but a quieter, stranger guilt that shows up much further down the road. The guilt of catching yourself laughing at something, really laughing, and feeling your own laughter turn on you mid-breath, as if joy were a kind of betrayal. The guilt of realizing you went a whole afternoon without thinking of him, and instead of feeling relieved, feeling ashamed. If that's happened to you, I need you to hold on to that feeling for just a moment, because we're going to come back to it, and what it actually means may surprise you. But before I tell you what that guilt is really pointing toward, there's something else you need to understand first, and it's this. The whole idea that healing means grief eventually disappearing was never true to begin with. It was a comfort someone offered you when they didn't know what else to say. And comfort offered in a moment of helplessness isn't the same thing as truth. The truth is stranger, and honestly, I think it's kinder. Stay with me tonight, because by the end of this, I think something in your chest is going to feel a little lighter than it has in a long while. Let's get there together. If you've stayed with me this far, what comes next was written with you specifically in mind. So let's talk honestly about the real complication here, the one underneath the guilt. The real complication isn't that you're grieving wrong, or too long, or too visibly, or too privately. The real complication is that somewhere along the way, without anyone ever sitting you down to explain it, you absorbed the idea that love has a shelf life on it, that continuing to feel the loss of him years later means you haven't done the work, haven't processed it properly, haven't moved through the stages the way the pamphlet said you would. So you started keeping score against yourself. counting how many times a week you still cry, wondering if other widows your age have stopped by now, and what's wrong with you that you haven't. Here's what I want you to actually hear. Underneath all of that scorekeeping, there is no schedule for this. There never was one. The people who told you grief has a timeline were almost always trying to comfort themselves as much as you. Because watching someone else's pain reminds all of us of our own eventual losses, and it's a very human, very forgivable thing to want a tidy ending to someone else's story so we can look away from our own fear. But you don't owe anyone a tidy ending. You are allowed to still miss him at 70 the way you missed him at 60. And it doesn't mean you failed at anything. It means you loved someone worth missing for a long time, which, when you say it plainly like that, sounds less like a wound and more like an achievement. I think about a woman who wrote to me not long ago. She'd lost her husband nearly a decade earlier, and she told me she still set his coffee cup out most mornings before catching herself. Still some mornings, after all these years. She said she'd finally stopped apologizing to herself for it. What she said next stayed with me, and I want to share it with you because I think it might be the truest sentence anyone has ever written to me about this. She said, "I stopped waiting to miss him less and started noticing everything I'd become because I once loved him enough to miss him this much." I read that sentence 3 times myself before I understood what she was really telling me. And what I think she was telling me is exactly what I want to talk about with you now. There's a name for what actually happens inside a person carrying a loss this long, and I want to explain it to you simply, without any of the clinical distance those words usually come wrapped in. The psychologist Carl Jung had a concept he called the transcendent function, and underneath the complicated name is a very simple, very human idea, that the mind has a natural, built-in capacity to hold 2 opposite things at once, the grief and the growth, the missing and the living, and fuse them into something entirely new, something that is neither pure sorrow nor pure moving on, but a third thing altogether, not healed in the sense of erased, healed in the sense of whole. That coffee cup the woman still sets out isn't a sign she's stuck. It's the visible seam where the old love and the new life have been quietly stitching themselves together for years, without her permission, without her even noticing most days. This is also, I think, why the guilt shows up when you laugh, and why it's worth understanding rather than just enduring. Jung talked about a pattern he called enantiodromia, the strange, almost stubborn way that anything pushed to its furthest extreme eventually begins turning into its opposite. The deepest grief, held honestly and not avoided, doesn't stay grief forever. It reaches a kind of ceiling, and then, without announcement, it starts converting itself into something else. Tenderness, gratitude, a fierce and unexpected appreciation for the ordinary Tuesday afternoon. That flicker of laughter that frightened you wasn't a betrayal of him at all. It was the extreme of your sorrow beginning its long, quiet turn toward its opposite, exactly the way Jung described it, happening in every human being who lets grief run its full course instead of freezing it in place out of fear. I won't pretend the season after a loss like this is anything but hard. Some people call it a dark night of the soul. And there's real truth folded into that old phrase. There genuinely is a stretch, sometimes lasting years, where the person you were seems to have gone missing right alongside the person you lost, and you're left standing in a house that used to hold 2 identities and now technically only holds 1, except you don't recognize that remaining one either, not for a while. That stretch is not a detour away from healing. It is the road itself, uncomfortable as that is to hear. Nobody arrives at the far side of a loss like this without walking straight through the middle of it first. And I think part of why so many women stay stuck is that they keep searching for a way around, when the only way that has ever actually worked is straight through. So why does the ache still catch you off guard on certain evenings and not others, seemingly at random, years after everyone assumed you'd have it figured out? Hold on to that question for a moment, because I don't think it's actually random at all, and understanding why might change how you experience the next one that arrives. We'll come back to that in just a moment, because first I want to talk about what Jung called individuation, since it's tangled up in the answer. Individuation is simply the lifelong process of becoming fully, unapologetically yourself, and it tends to accelerate hard in exactly the seasons that feel the most disorienting, widowhood chief among them. Because losing the person your identity had been quietly built alongside forces, a kind of reckoning nothing else quite manages to force. The ache that surprises you on certain evenings and not others isn't random weakness. It tends to arrive precisely on the evenings your sense of self has shifted a little. When some small piece of the old shared identity has finished dissolving and a slightly newer, more fully yours version of you has taken its place. The ache, in other words, is often less about him specifically and more a kind of growing pain. The psyche registering just how much of you has changed since the version of your life that included him every single day. You might be telling yourself quietly that it's too late for any of this to matter now, too many years gone, too much time spent simply surviving rather than growing. It isn't. The transcendent function doesn't run on a deadline any more than grief does. I've watched it happen in women well into their 80s, a sudden, late-blooming softness arriving decades after a loss, as though the psyche had simply been composing something in the background the entire time and finally decided the piece was ready to be heard. You are not behind on your own healing. There was never a race to begin with. If you've been carrying a private theory that continuing to grieve someone means you failed to properly let go of him, I want to gently take that theory apart before we go any further, because I don't think it will survive close inspection. Letting go, as most people mean it, implies there's a clean separation available to you, a door you can close all the way and walk from. But love this long, this real, was never something you can fully close a door on, and I don't believe you're meant to. What you're actually doing, slowly, isn't letting go of him. It's making room, inside the same chest that still misses him, for everything else that's still allowed to live there too, including, eventually, joy that doesn't require an apology attached to it. There is a particular kind of strength that only ever gets built this way, in rooms like the one you're probably sitting in right now, alone, at an hour when the television has gone quiet and there's no one to perform composure for. Nobody sees this part of the work. There's no audience for the night you finally slept through without reaching for his side of the bed first. No one applauding the morning you drank your coffee, sitting down instead of standing at the counter. The way I did myself, for longer than I like to admit, before I finally let myself sit properly at my own table again. But that strength is real, whether or not anyone ever witnesses it. And I think it might be the most honest kind of strength there is, the kind built with no one watching. For no reason, except that you were determined to keep living a full life anyway. So let's reframe this together, plainly, because I think you've earned a plain answer after everything we've just walked through. What feels, some nights, like evidence that you're broken or behind or somehow failing at grief is actually the opposite. It's evidence of growth in progress. Every time the guilt shows up when you laugh, that's not proof you're forgetting him. That's the transcendent function doing its quiet work, fusing the missing, and the living into something sturdier than either one alone. Every time you catch the ache arriving out of nowhere on an ordinary Tuesday, years after everyone assumed you'd be finished, that isn't relapse. That's simply the size grief has always been, showing up again briefly in a life that has otherwise grown enormous around it. You are not shrinking the loss. You were never supposed to. You are the one who keeps getting bigger, keeps building more rooms onto the house, and the loss stays roughly the same size in the corner it's always occupied, which means, mathematically, emotionally, however you want to measure it, it simply takes up less and less of the whole of you as the years go on. Not because you loved him less, but because you kept living more. Something is already shifting in you, even now, even as you're sitting here listening to this by whatever light you've got going in your own room tonight. I can feel it in the fact that you've stayed this long, that you didn't turn this off during the harder parts, the parts about the coffee cup and the guilt and the dark night that doesn't announce when it's over. That kind of staying is its own quiet evidence. It means some part of you is finally ready to stop treating your grief as a problem to be solved and start treating it as proof of a love that was real enough to still matter this many years on. That shift doesn't arrive all at once, with trumpets. It arrives the way most real changes do in the second half of life, quietly, almost invisibly, one ordinary evening at a time, until one day you notice you've been different for a while without ever marking the exact moment it happened. Let me walk you through something for a moment, and I want you to actually close your eyes if you're somewhere safe to do that. Or simply let your gaze soften toward the fire if you're not. Picture an evening some months from now. Nothing dramatic has to have happened in between. No sudden miracle, no single conversation that fixes everything. Just time and a little more gentleness toward yourself than you've been offering lately. You're sitting somewhere comfortable, maybe this exact chair, and the light outside is doing that particular thing it does in early evening, turning gold along the edges of the room. You think of him, the way you do most days still, and the missing arrives the way it always has. But this time, right behind it, something else arrives too. A memory that makes you smile before it makes you ache. A small warmth that doesn't feel like betrayal anymore. Because somewhere between now and then, you stopped keeping score against your own joy. Your shoulders sit a little lower than they do tonight. Your chest holds both things at once, the loss and the light, without one having to cancel out the other. You'll feel lighter, not because the missing disappeared, but because you finally stopped fighting the fact that it was always allowed to sit beside everything good that came after. Here is what I want you to actually do, starting tonight. Not someday, not when you feel ready, but tonight, in whatever small way you can manage. The next time you catch yourself laughing or catch a stretch of an afternoon passing without the ache showing up, do not apologize for it, not even quietly, not even just to yourself. Say it out loud if you can, even just once. I am allowed to feel light without it, meaning I loved him any less. That single sentence, spoken honestly, does more work than a year of silently punishing yourself ever could. And if you still keep something of his nearby, the way I still keep his watch in the drawer of the hallway table, the one I sometimes open now just to smile rather than to cry, let that object stay exactly where it is. It isn't holding you back. It's simply proof that the house you've built since has room enough for the past to live comfortably alongside the present instead of having to be locked away in a separate wing entirely. I know some of you watching tonight are earlier in this than that woman with the coffee cup, earlier than I am myself most days. Maybe it hasn't been years yet. Maybe it's been months, or maybe it's been so recent that even hearing the word grief spoken, this plainly feels like too much for one evening. If that's you, I want to say something directly to you before we go any further together. None of what I've described tonight is a schedule you need to hit. I am not telling you that you should already feel lighter, or that if you don't, something is wrong with you. I'm only telling you what tends to become possible, eventually, for those willing to stop treating their own grief as an enemy to defeat. There is no wrong pace here. There is only your pace, and it is allowed to be exactly as slow as it needs to be. You might also be telling yourself that talking about growth this soon, or even years in, feels disloyal somehow, as if focusing on what you've become risks implying the loss didn't matter as much as it did. It doesn't work that way, and I want to be firm with you about this because I think you need someone to be firm with you about it. The growth doesn't diminish the loss. It's built entirely out of the loss. The way a tree grows around a fence post, left leaning against it, wrapping new wood around the old obstacle year after year until the two are simply inseparable, each one shaping exactly what the other became. Nobody looking at that tree years later would say the fence post didn't matter. They'd say the opposite, that the tree grew exactly the shape it did because of what it had to grow around. You are that tree. He is that fence post. And the shape you're becoming, whatever shape that ends up being, will always have been built partly out of loving him and partly out of surviving losing him. And there is no shame anywhere in that sentence, not one particle of it. If you've stayed with me through all of this tonight, I want you to know that what comes next was written especially for you, the one who didn't turn away from a hard subject on a night when it might have been easier to watch something lighter instead. That choice, to sit with something difficult instead of avoiding it, is itself a form of the very strength we've been talking about. You keep choosing it, quietly, without applause, and that adds up to something. Even on the nights it doesn't feel like anything is adding up at all. I'd love to know, if you're willing to share it in the comments below, what loss you've grown around in your own life, whether it was a husband or someone else entirely apparent, a sister, a friend who mattered more than the world ever gave her credit for. I read every single comment, truly, even the ones that come in at 3 in the morning when sleep won't come, and the only company available is a screen, and whoever else happens to be awake with you. And if you're watching this tonight with your own tea gone cold beside you, tell me where you're watching from. It matters to me, more than you probably realize, to know exactly who's sitting with me by this fire each night. You are so far from the only woman carrying a grief that never quite shrank the way she was promised it would. Tell me I'm not wrong about that in the comments, and let's remind each other of it together, because I think a great many of us have been quietly assuming we were the only ones still missing someone this much, this many years on, when in fact entire rooms of us, watching separately from our own kitchens and living rooms scattered across the country, have been carrying almost the exact same weight the entire time. What's one thing tonight made you think about a little differently than you did an hour ago? I genuinely love to know, because these conversations only ever become real once you tell me your side of them. And if tonight's conversation found you at exactly the moment you needed it, I'd love it if you simply typed the word steady in the comments below, so I know it landed where it was meant to. Before I let you go tonight, I want to leave you with something to actually carry out of this conversation and into the rest of your evening, because I don't want this to be one of those talks that feels meaningful for 12 minutes and then evaporates the moment the screen goes dark. Grief, real grief, the kind built on real love, was never meant to shrink down to nothing. If it did, it would mean the love itself had shrunk down to nothing too. And I don't believe that's ever what you wanted, not even on the hardest nights when the missing felt unbearable. What you actually wanted, I think, without ever quite finding the words for it, was to become someone strong enough to hold both things at once, the loss and a full life lived anyway, right alongside it, neither one erasing the other. So tonight, however small the house feels, however quiet it gets by 5 o'clock, I want you to remember this. You are not failing at grief by still feeling it. You are not disloyal for laughing again, for setting out 1 coffee cup instead of 2, and finding some mornings that you can do it without your chest caving in. You are not behind some invisible schedule that everyone else seems to have finished ahead of you. You are simply a woman who loved someone enough that missing him became part of the architecture of your life, and who kept building anyway, room by room, evening by evening, until the house got bigger than the loss, even though the loss never once got smaller. Come back and sit with me again tomorrow night if you'd like to. There is more I want to share with you, more of these quiet truths that almost nobody says plainly enough. And I'll be right here by this same fire whenever you're ready to pull your chair up again. This is a conversation we can keep having for as long as you need it, one evening at a time for as many evenings as it takes. You are not behind in your own healing. You are not required to grieve on anyone else's timeline but your own. And you are, right now, exactly as strong as you need to be for tonight, which, in the end, is really all any of us are ever asked to be.